Uh, Good afternoon. Thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Hosein Badran. I'm with the Internet Society based out of Ottawa, Canada. This webinar is part of the official launch of the Global Encryption Coalition, which the steering committee is composed of the Internet Society, the Center for Democracy and Technology, or CDT, as well as Global Partners Digital, the subject of our webinar this afternoon is quite timely, actually. It deals with health, the internet, and COVID-19, and how government backdoor access proposals threaten Canadian health and security online. Let me share with you my screen to share with you the panelists, the esteemed panelists that we have with us today. It is my pleasure that we have in our panel today Christopher Parsons, who is a Senior Research Associate with Citizens Lab. We have Brenda McPhail, Director of Privacy and Technology Surveillance at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. And we are very pleased also to have with us Christopher Prince, Strategic Policy Analyst, Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. And as I mentioned, my name is Hosein Badran. I'm with the Internet Society. I'll stop sharing here. The topic of the discussion today is quite timely, as I mentioned, and it has to do with the resiliency of the internet in terms of the trustworthiness of the internet, which encryption is a key enabler and a key component for trustworthy communication, as well as taken into consideration the existing health crisis situation that we are in with COVID-19. So how to really to gauge the debate where we are regarding enabling a trustworthy communication over an encrypted traffic streams, as well as encrypted data at rest, and at the same time looking into health considerations as well as privacy considerations, and mentioning as well looking into proposals coming from Western government in recent times regarding promoting exceptional access to really give law enforcement exceptional access to encrypted communication. So this kind of debate has started particularly last year, or even before, as we will hear from our panelists, and then got some steam last year when Attorney General Barr invited the private sector and other players to allow for exceptional access to enforcement, citing specific concerns that I'm not sure our panelists will mention, which prompted really a strong opinion from civil society as well as from industry to the contrary. Were made quite clear through open letters by civil societies led by OTI that encryption is one of the most secure way to communicate over the internet. So this kind of debate has continued, has been echoed as well from in the Five Eyes nations, and has been echoed to some extent in Canada, from a statement from the Minister of Public Safety mentioning something along the lines that Attorney General Barr has mentioned. Since then, what the major development has been the COVID-19 pandemic that we are in, and the fact that that all of us are staying at home, are working from home, and our children are being educated remotely at home as well. And we utilize the internet really for a tool to communicate with family members and friends, or we are not allowed to see physically due to the quarantine situation. So it becomes a livelihood for us to be able to communicate, work, get education, and to survive. We are trying to, in this panel, we're trying to address these issues from different perspectives, from different angles, let's say. One angle comes from the area of research, and we have Citizens Lab, which is a pioneer and well-known and well-respected research institute University of Toronto, the Moncton School of Business, with years of experience in research related to privacy and security. And we have the angle of Civil Liberties Association, which looks into rights of individuals, where technology plays a pivotal role in making data available, what kinds of risks are associated with this. But linking again, as I mentioned, with our current situation regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. And we also have the angle of the oversight that the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada has, being an entity that reports to Parliament. It's not part of the government, and has its mission to really to protect and promote the privacy rights of individuals, and its mandate to oversee compliance with both the Privacy Act and PPDA in Canada. So we were able to have quite a niche discussion regarding these aspects, again linking it with encryption aspects, and linking it again with the COVID situation. The flow of the panel will be really to provide time for intervention from each of our esteemed speakers, laying down their points of view, from their experience, how the debate over encryption has been evolving, and laying the framework of where we see things are happening now, and perhaps moving to the near future, and then opening for questions from our attendees and our audience. Please type your questions in the Q&A panel, so that we can see these questions and we will be able to relay them to our speakers. We'll have also questions from myself to the panelists, and then to the end we'll summarize by last thoughts from each of our speakers. If I may begin, Chris Parsons, please, from your perspective as a leading think tank and research institutes that has looked into the areas of encryption and privacy over several years, how do you see the debate has developed over the last short period, and where we are now, and linking it with the COVID situation? Your perspectives, please. Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks for putting this together, Hosein, and thanks to ISOC for doing all the work in putting this together. It's really appreciated, and to everyone who's watching, hello. It's a little different not to see you in person, but it's lovely to speak to you nonetheless. So ahead of this, the three of us had a discussion as to how this would flow. So I'm really going to start by providing the background that the other two panelists are then going to riff off of. So I'm going to be walking through in a few different stages. So I'm going to be looking down because I have written notes, so it's not that I'm ignoring you. Just have to see what I'm doing. So in terms of structure, what I'm going to talk to you about is first, really quickly, what is encryption? Put a few terms out of the way because I know that we're all going to be using them, so we're all on the same page. Then I'm going to really quickly touch on why encryption matters. It's going to be very fast because I know that Chris Prince and Brenda are probably going to do a lot more in that space. I don't want to crowd them out in any possible way. I'm then going to talk about the epochs of the encryption debate. Again, where have we come to get to the point we're at now? And then finally, just some concluding thoughts. So where's the debate now? And what do we really need to think through when we're talking about encryption and the potential risks of undermining it? So first, what is encryption? It's one term that's applied to a whole bunch of different ways that data tends to be secured, to be frank. And one of the challenges in the encryption debates is usually we don't define what we're talking about. That might be intentional, it might be unintentional on the part of governments, but that is the way it is. So what are some kinds of encryption at a high conceptual level? First, there's encryption at rest. So when your smartphone is powered off or when it's locked, any contemporary phone is automatically going to involve encrypting the device, so that if your phone is stolen, someone has to put in your passcode, and if they don't put it in, your data is secured at rest. So all at rest means is on the device itself, it is secured from other parties from being able to access it, unless they have the code or the decryption key to gain entry to it. Second, there's encryption there's encryption in transit. And so encryption in transit refers to situations where you're moving data from one location to another, usually across the internet. And parties who intercept that data in real time are unable to decrypt it. So that doesn't mean that it's encrypted at either end. So as an example, when you're sending, when you're typing an email in Gmail or Outlook or something like that using the web client, you have an encrypted communication to that server. So your data is very secured, but obviously you're seeing the plain text on your side when you're typing it in, and on Google or Microsoft's end, they also have access to the plain text so that they can do their own activities on the text that's being input. And in transit is often quite important because when we may discuss in this webinar, historically authorities would listen into phone calls or listen to communications, and that's where wiretaps took place. And now it's a lot harder to do because you can't just go to a Bell Canada or an AT&T or a BT and sort of clip onto the wires and get the plain text of a communication because it's usually encrypted in transit. Third, there's what's called end-to-end encryption. This is a situation where I can send Hosein a message or Brenda a message using Signal or WhatsApp or a few other systems. And the only people who have the encryption and decryption keys are the people at the ends of the communication. So it would only be Hosein and myself or Brenda and myself who would be able to decrypt it. So it's a little different from encryption at rest because it may or may not be encrypted at rest, to be honest. But at least for the purposes of the transmission, no other party can gain access to it. And that means that no one is issuing an encryption or decryption key. So our devices are generating and using them. And then we also have a difference between often when we're talking about content being encrypted. So a message that you send is secured, so no one else can see it. But whenever we're talking about contemporary communications environments, there's the content of the communication, sort of what I'm saying right now in the video, and there's the metadata that's attached to the conversation. And that's going to be all the routing information, all the size of the communication, what server you're going to. Like there's a whole lot of different variables. And on that side, encryption really doesn't serve us very well because it's very hard to encrypt metadata because we use it all the time just to engage in the communications that we're taking in the first place. And then one thing that we may mention a few times, so I'll just throw it out there so no one else has to define it, is we often talk about what's called strong encryption in these debates. Strong encryption just means either encryption at rest, in transit, or end-to-end, but it's a kind of encryption that has not been compromised. So there isn't a vulnerability or weakness that's been deliberately added into it. And that's important because as I and I expect the other panelists will talk about when there's the possibility of backdoors or vulnerabilities or something like that, as soon as you insert those deficiencies, you no longer have strong encryption. You may still have encryption, but it's not strong. So why does encryption matter? At a really high level, first, it matters for fundamental rights. It's used to protect freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion. It's used by journalists. It's really used by a huge number of different parties to exercise their rights and freedoms through digital mediums. And I suspect Brenda may have more to say about that in her presentation. It's used in e-commerce. Indeed, the reason why encryption is so popular right now is principally because of e-commerce in the 90s. We needed to figure out how to communicate securely back and forth. And that's why it became prominent in e-commerce websites well before it became common in most other venues. It's also remarkably important for public safety and national security, which is often not the way that we think about these things, or at least this isn't the way the debate is often construed. But we know that we need encryption for crime prevention. When we lose our phones, if our phones aren't encrypted, then our whole digital lives are exposed to whomever finds it. So maybe it's a great person who wants to return our phone. Maybe it's someone who's stolen our phone and has different interests and goals. It also enables law enforcement to communicate securely back and forth in a way that ensures the confidentiality of their investigations. And it protects people's privacy because there's any number of investigations that take place at any time. But actually, it turns out that someone was not, in fact, guilty of an indictable offense. And so because it's secured, there's a reduced likelihood that that data then creeps out into the world after law enforcement or security agencies have said, there's not enough there to do very much. And the other reason why encryption matters is because if you get it wrong, it has a really bad tendency to boomerang. So to give you just a quick example, in the 1990s, the US government authorized the sale of American products that had encryption baked in. But when you sold internationally, you had to have this really weak encryption. People still bought it, Microsoft still sold it, the world went on. Fast forward into the late 2000s, early 2010s, and some of those same servers are still running. And guess what? That crappy encryption that wasn't great at the time has become terrible now. And subsequently, there have been data breaches, data exfiltrations, because there's a bad policy decision in the 90s, and we didn't see those impacts, even though we predicted them, until about a decade later. So encryption lingers. Policy decisions matter, and they don't just matter today, but they matter in 5 years, 10 years, and 15 years. So what are the epochs of the encryption debates that we've been having in the West, principally, to be honest, but it definitely has expanded beyond that. To begin, law enforcement agencies are usually the organizations that have been advocating for access to encrypted communications. Signals intelligence agencies and security agencies have done that less. Now, on the one hand, they know that they need encryption to do their own stuff, but it's also because they have their own special sauce. So they hire cryptographers to find really esoteric vulnerabilities. They also have a tendency through the CIA and other groups of inserting vulnerabilities into hardware quite often. So we've seen it with a company called Crypto AG and any number of other instances where the signals intelligence agencies have found quiet ways of doing things, whereas law enforcement is really coming forward and saying, we want a public policy solution in law. So what are some of these epochs? So in the pre-90s, you saw really strict controls. So this was really when encryption was still the domain of the military. And so in the United States, the NSA had to sign off on most of your uses of encryption because it's a protected product. And this is a pre-internet era. It's also very complicated to do. Like, there's lots of reasons why the internet wasn't encrypted to begin with, but part of those reasons were it was really hard to do. And to encrypt the internet when it was being born, you would have had to transform the entire internet mostly into a top secret national security environment, which wouldn't have been great for our ability to have calls today. So when we move into the 90s, it's really the first of the crypto wars. And during this period, what you saw was the US Congress say, hey, we think that if we're going to allow encryption, we should be able to get access to the communications. And so this is what was called the Clipper chip situation. And they called for key escrows. So you could have a secure communication with another person, but under judicial warrant, law enforcement would be able to say, okay, we want to know what Chris and Hosein or Chris and Brenda had been talking about. So there's a warrant component that was in there, but it turns out that the way that this was done was not very technically robust. So in addition to baseline concerns, should the government be able to have this power, also the Clipper chip system didn't work. And so it sort of fell apart. We saw liberalization of cryptography as American businesses wanted to go into the world, such as Microsoft and others. And this was the period where Canada came out with its initial position on encryption, which was, as a country, as a government, the Canadian government held that strong encryption should be available, and it should be used to facilitate freedoms and commerce and so forth. So it was a speech, and that actually acted as our bedrock for the Canadian position up until very recently, which I'll discuss in a moment. So when we move into the 2000s, there was a period of relative quiet. Now, why was there a period of quiet? Part of it was law enforcement was figuring out how you do the internet. But the other piece was most of the internet really wasn't very well secured. And so it was pretty easy to get someone's phone and open it. And it wasn't secured by anything more than a passcode. There was no encryption. You could monitor the internet, and most of the communications weren't encrypted. So wiretaps were, a bit of a pain, but they were relatively doable outside of edge cases. And this is, during the boom of the internet that followed the dot-com implosion. Now that's changed. So the current period is sort of either Crypto War 2 or it is the Crypto Cold War, as I tend to think about, and it's getting warmer as the months go on. And this really accelerated after the revelations of Edward Snowden, to be honest. It was coming a little bit before then. There were concerns about, going dark and law enforcement not being able to gain access to things, but it picked up after Snowden came out, and then all the internet companies and all sorts of other organizations said, okay, we need encryption. This is inappropriate. There is mass surveillance. We need to put a stop to this as best we're able to on a technical side, if not a policy side. And because of that, law enforcement that had previously in the 2000s had access to communications were all of a sudden saying, all right, we need backdoors. And there's been any number of rationales that have been presented for it, from terrorism to serious crime to now the current mainline concern being promoted is the safety of children online and child abuse imagery. So where's Canada? In 2019, there was a Five Eyes ministerial, which included the Canadian government, where we really changed our position. So what we said, along with our other Five Eyes allies, so in the Five Eyes, just for clarity, is Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. So what Canada and our allies said is, technology companies who are building technologies, you need to design your encryption such that with judicial warrant, we're able to access it, because we need to protect all members of society. We don't want these zones created where law enforcement doesn't have visibility into it with judicial oversight. Public safety has said that they're not calling for backdoors and encryption. It's not entirely clear how you can compel or ask companies to enable their systems to decrypt it and provide it to authorities, and it's not a backdoor, but I trust there is some lawyer in public safety that has figured out through some linguistic knots why that might be a definitional bit of sanity. But practically for our purposes, it was the first time we saw the Canadian government come out and say, strong encryption? No, we don't think that's a great idea. Now, in the COVID situation, I think we're really seeing why encryption is so important. So advocates and policymakers for a long time have been saying, like, what about e-commerce? What about work from home? What about telemedicine? What about everything we're doing in our lives right now, frankly? And so COVID actually casts into relief the importance of encryption. It's important that your work communications are secured from, frankly, a lot of bad guys who are trying to listen in on communication and engage in corporate espionage and just disruption, or frankly, you know, the kids next door who are home all the time and just want to mess with your Wi-Fi and see what you're doing because they're home all the time now. But there's more than just that. If we reverse if we move away from strong encryption, what's at risk? Might we solve some crimes? Probably. I mean, that makes sense. I mean, if there was a cop tailing you every day, you'd probably solve more crimes that way too, but we're not proposing that. So it's not a proportionate response to the problems facing society. But if we do weaken encryption, it means that things like update mechanisms might also become weakened. So right now, we cryptographically assure that when you get an update from Apple or from Google or from Microsoft or whoever, there's a cryptographic proof that what is being downloaded and updated on your device is what was made. So if we move away from strong encryption, there's the possibility that bad actors can start inserting inappropriate or inaccurate or frankly dangerous updates that are not from the companies themselves. Second, in Canada and really around the world, we're talking about 5G and there's all sorts of concerns about security. One of the many ways of mitigating some of those concerns, and it doesn't matter if it's Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung, Huawei, ZTE, doesn't matter what the manufacturer is, there's going to be problems. One of the ways of mitigating some of those problems is enabling strong end-to-end encryption. If you build backdoors into the encryption, you lose a lot of those protections that we're probably going to need for our next generation communications infrastructure. And really, I think that that's where we need to think about this debate is we can't consider encryption in isolation. We can't think of it just as it relates to child abuse imagery. We can't think of it just as it pertains to disinformation, misinformation. We can't talk about it just as it relates to commercial applications. We really need to think broadly. What does it enable? What harms does it mitigate? Doesn't protect against everything. And what possible harms are available when people misuse it? Once we go through those broader set of questions, I think we get to a policy position that makes more sense, especially when we recognize that changes that we make in Canada or changes the Americans make in the United States, they're also going to be changes that are taken advantage by the Russian government, the Chinese government, the Iranian government, bad actors in Canada, because there's going to be some unfortunately not perfect cops. We really need to think through what these harms are going to be, because what we build through policy and through technology isn't something we can reverse on a dime. It's going to be there for a decade plus. So any decisions that we make now have to take that into account. And I'll turn back to you, Hosein.
Thank you much, Chris. I think I really appreciate the insights from a historical perspective, and also where we are at the moment. and the risks that, as you highlighted, regarding if we take the easy path of weakening encryption and communicating in something like plain text or something that's really very easy to decipher, that we open a can of worms or Pandora box regarding all kinds of risks to our security of private communication, industrial communication, critical infrastructure, and the like. I move now to Brenda with the civil society lens, civil liberties lens that CCLA presents, and the points of view regarding how do you see the debate of encryption playing particularly on the rights of individuals and the risks engaged, and putting the lens of the pandemic or situation that we are in today, where the technology is being used for points like contact tracing or trying to control the spread of disease. Your insights and your views would be very, very valuable. Brenda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to join the panel. Thanks to the audience for joining us on a Thursday afternoon, Eastern Daylight Time. It's really a pleasure to participate on behalf of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and we're so happy to be a member of the Global Encryption Coalition. So the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, for those who have never heard of us, is an independent, non-profit, non-governmental organization that stands up for the rights and freedoms and civil liberties of people across Canada. We've been around since 1964, and we act in three primary ways. First of all, we're a legal advocacy organization. So we are the organization who's done more interventions than any other nonprofit at the Supreme Court of Canada. And increasingly, we're bringing our own public interest litigation before the courts. We also do our best to intervene in policy conversations across all of Canada's jurisdictions. And we have a really active public education program where back in the good old days pre-February, when we used to be allowed to see one another face-to-face, we did workshops in person with roughly 10,000 students a year from kindergarten to early university level. So that's us. And in a way, the fact who we are and what we do explains why we care so much about the encryption debates. My portfolio is privacy, technology, and surveillance. And of course, all three pieces of that mouthful of a program name interact with the encryption debate. So I'm going to start with a little bit on what the rights are at stake in the encryption debates. And Chris has kind of laid it out in summary. Essentially, the availability of encryption has come to be recognized as intrinsically bound with rights to privacy, free speech, freedom of association, and freedom of religion. These are all rights that in Canada and elsewhere around the world are recognized as foundational and fundamental. While privacy is the right that tends to take the stage most dominantly when we start talking about encryption, I think it's really important to recognize that the reason that is true is because privacy in this context, particularly of technologically mediated communications, is a gateway right that facilitates our ability to exercise and enjoy all those other rights. So particularly since the explosion of internet availability, when we stopped so often talking to one another face to face and started using a wide range of technologically mediated forms of communication, across the internet and using the devices we carry in our pockets, exercising our ability to have free speech really is fundamentally dependent more and more on our ability to access the internet, to have devices that provide secure means of communication. And of course, part of the foundation of that security is encryption. There's all kinds of excellent data available. There's been some really strong qualitative studies that show really clearly that people who understand that they're being surveilled, who understand that what they say or what they're looking for online is the subject of scrutiny tend to behave differently. So some of this research right after the Snowden revelations, for example, looked at what people were looking at on Wikipedia. And it was found that people were more afraid not just to look up topics like terrorism and bombs, but also topics like sexually transmitted diseases and abortion and health risks, because they were worried that these topics that were, or searches that were very personal to them, might be the subject of viewing either by malicious actors or by the state. And this concern around being watched isn't just online. In the age of the smart city, and we've just had a very public debate about that in Toronto that ended last week with Google's sibling Sidewalk Labs choosing to walk away from their vision of a city built from the internet up in the heart of Toronto's waterfront. And in the age of the Internet of Things, where we're increasingly being encouraged and embracing digital personal assistants and thermostats that we can talk to or control through our phone, and fridges that can help us compile our grocery lists by watching what, taking a peek at what's on the shelf. As we invite these kinds of technologies into our home for convenience, increasingly they are collecting information about us that requires protection if we don't want to all of a sudden become open books to anyone who has the capacity to enter into our data streams. So, in other words, the debates about encryption aren't just about safety and security in online spaces, but increasingly they're about safety and security in our homes and the physical spaces that we move through as well. So we've got concerns around, we've got a focus on privacy in the encryption debate, and understanding that it's not just privacy that's at stake. But at the same time, privacy does tend to be the place where people who advocate for backdoors or for breaking encryption tend to focus. And I think that's probably, and when you think about it, in a legal context, all of the rights engaged in the encryption debate, so free expression, freedom of association, as well as privacy in a legal context, are rights which might require balancing with competing rights in a court. None of these rights are absolute in and of themselves, and we recognize that there are, competing interests in our exercise and enjoyment of these rights. So why is privacy the one that in many ways is the focus of attention? And why is it the one most subject to misunderstandings? And here, all you have to do is think about the if you have nothing to hide boondoggle that anyone who's ever had a conversation about privacy eventually has tossed up at them. And I think it's because privacy is also the right that in the age of contemporary communications and surveillance capitalism is the right that's been the most subject to behind the scenes erosions. Erosions which are then subsequently used to justify further erosions. If you already willingly share your information on social media, why shouldn't governments have access to that information? Why shouldn't they be able to use it if you want to share it with your mom? Why shouldn't they be able to use it to keep you safe? And in this current pandemic, if you're willing to give up so much just for fun, why aren't you willing to give it up to protect your friends and your neighbors and your family and our society in general? So that brings us to the question of encryption in the time of COVID. And there are sort of three technologies or three uses of technology in this crisis that I'm going to touch on super briefly. The first one is technologically assisted contact tracing and encryption. In Canada and around the world, there's a huge amount of discussion and debate about creating apps that in some ways are being held out as a potential silver bullet to help us fight this virus or to mitigate the risk of the spread of this virus. And to make it relevant to this debate, of course, one of the main ways that these apps are being framed as safe and privacy protective is in fact through promises of encryption. Encryption on devices, encryption in transit, encryption in centralized databases that might be holding the information that are collected. So there are two kinds of models of contact tracing that are being pitched. One is a centralized model, where data would be generated by your device, but shared and stored in a centralized repository. One of the primary examples of that, I think, is the National Health Service in the United Kingdom's Stop COVID-19 app. And the other model is that's probably the prime, or there are many proponents, but has particularly picked up steam since Google and Apple's announcement that they were going to work together in a fairly unprecedented collaboration to produce first an API that public health could build on to allow collection of contact to enable technologically assisted contact tracing, and then subsequently to actually build the capacity directly into the foundation of both of their operating systems, again, to be then leveraged by public health agencies in order to permit contact tracing. What's interesting to me is not sort of the technical details of that, although they're also fascinating, but from a societal perspective, it's the way that encryption and anonymity are really being sort of embraced in the public relations effort to encourage the use and uptake of these tools. So from encryption being a dirty word in the law enforcement context, it's become a magic word in the health context. Here in Canada, last week, we had 3 senators who recently sponsored a survey with some, where they were trying to figure out whether the people of Canada would embrace the concept of contact tracing, among other things. And their data suggested that 80% of Canadians would support the use of a mobile device by public health to notify people that they had been near, in proximity, to someone testing positive. And really remarkably, 65% thought that it would be okay if that kind of an application were mandatory. But really crucially, the framing of the questions that led to those answers was essentially, if the tools were accurate, if their coverage was complete, and if your data was 100% safely collected using the best technical means possible, which of course we understand to mean, or to include encryption, then would you agree to the use of these apps? But that context is not part of the public reporting about how much people in Canada might potentially want to embrace this technology. And it reminded me a little bit when I read this survey of another one that was conducted in 2016 by the Toronto Star newspaper and the CBC, which was during one of the resurgences that Chris was talking about of the going dark debates in Canada. And in that survey, 77% of the people who responded said that police should be able to compel access to an encrypted device if they had a warrant. Mm-hmm. And the fun part of that survey was that only 15% of the people who participated in the survey said they actually encrypted their own communications. So what this suggested at the time is that people are really willing to give up access to other people's data for a purpose that they think is a good idea. And that they were willing to pass judgment on the appropriate uses of a technology that they didn't use themselves. And I think those same impulses are rearing their heads in relation to this debate. So in the context of public health, there's a critical balance to be struck by those of us who care about and value encryption to still be really crystal clear about how it works and how it can protect information, but also where it falls short, not necessarily from a technical perspective, but also from a social perspective. And I think that's clearer when we talk about the next kind of technology that we're tossing around, which is the idea of immunity certificates. And an immunity certificate is essentially expresses the idea that we might at some point need to, in order to manage risk of the virus in our society, be required to carry some sort of evidence, probably digital, that we're either immune or have recently tested negative for COVID-19. with the theory that being able to present this proof is going to be a precursor to the ability to facilitate a safe economic and social restart. And there again, part of the conversation about how we could make these technologies in a way that would be privacy protective is that we can encrypt the data on our devices. We can store it locally and we can encrypt it. And we can use encryption to control or to protect the flows of data between devices when the certificates are read. And this is being pitched as saying there are ways in which we can technically create a privacy protective system that would allow the creation and sharing of immunity certificates. What that framing leaves out is that there are no strong technical ways, including through encryption, that can protect against the significant social consequences of creating categories of human who are safe and unsafe to participate in public life. So I think the immunity certificate case is a really clear example where it would be obviously necessary to include that kind of technical protection, but it's insufficient in and of itself to provide adequate human protection. And then we flip from the virus tracking and tracing and risk analysis aspects of technology in the time of COVID to the technologies that we're all relying on to get through our days. So those are the technologies about working from home. And there that's the example of ways in which strong and effective encryption does in fact provide the right protections people need in the current social context. And I think that because we're all working from home, and Chris has talked about this already, there's really an increasing public awareness of the important role that encryption is playing in protecting the data that we're generating and that we're using, that's stored on and transferred between our home devices for work purposes. Probably one of the best public awareness announcements or advertisements or awareness moments around encryption in relation to working from home has, of course, been the debates around the very technology that we're using for this webinar. It's Zoom. Citizen Lab, of course, did an amazing expose on all the problems relating to Zoom. But I think really fundamentally from a public policy perspective, what it did is it really publicized why encryption as part of a strong suite of security measures matters as a means of protecting communication technologies in times of pandemic or outside. I became the first member of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association ever to be invited to speak on the Sports Network radio station after the Zoom debate blew up, because that the level of public interest and concern about whether or not the platforms that we were using were exposing us to risk got so much public play that even in that sort of setting where rights and freedoms and security and cryptography are not the conversation du jour, became a matter of interest for the kind of audiences that pay attention on those channels of communication. So I'd wrap it up just by saying that for those of us who advocate for strong encryption, whether it's to protect rights or to do all of those other important things that Chris talked about, like supporting national security, enabling a strong online economy, what this pandemic has done is open up a policy window to help the public understand why encryption is necessary, why it matters, because as never before, there's a wide range of ways in which it's demonstrably necessary and impacts daily lives of a wider range of people who are sitting around and very aware of all of the new ways that they're working and the new implications of that for themselves. So I think we need to start thinking about, as advocates and people who care, some new rhetorics around this. I mean, the going dark metaphor is brilliant. It's absolutely riveting. The poor law enforcement officer stuck alone as the darkness falls, and yet he valiantly stands against the forces of crime. And in contrast, I think that what this opportunity does is open up ways to create new kinds of framings that put the individual and the individual's rights at the center of the encryption debates. It's a chance that we haven't had before, and I hope we can talk about new ways to capitalize on it as we move forward.
Thank you much, Brenda, for this. I really love the positive note of the opportunity for shape the policy debate moving forward and taking advantage of the current situation. I also love the notion of the encryption becoming the magic word now, with all, all the applications embedding encryption, and then particularly on the contact tracing side. I'm sure we'll have questions in this particular direction, and the issue of awareness, as you mentioned, people becoming aware of the role of secure communication, privacy in communication, is due to the current situation, is becoming more and more highlighted. It's something that we can certainly stress on. I move now to Chris Prince from the OPC, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. And as I mentioned, the role is the oversight really for how the privacy rights of privacy of individuals is being protected by, and the laws related to that, the privacy law and the PPDA law is applied by the government as well as from the private sector side. Chris, can you hear me?
Sorry, Hosein, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you. I was just making an introduction about the role of the OPC, and of course, you would be able to eloquently, much more eloquently describe that from your side, and how you see really the encryption debate in the recent past and the current situation and moving forward, evolving, take into consideration from your side the application of the privacy law to and the PPDA to the government actions, the private sector actions, law enforcement actions. I think your insights would be quite valuable to complement what Chris Bronson and Brenda have already so eloquently expressed. Please, the floor is yours.
Sure, thanks. So thank you everyone for participating today, and Chris and Brenda and Hosein for putting this together and sort of keeping us on track. We don't have a great deal of time left, and I realize that the technical level of sophistication of the listeners of these sorts of events is usually pretty amazing. So I'm going to go really quickly through the main points that I was hoping to make. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada was set up almost 40 years ago. The first Privacy Commissioner was set up in 1977. We originally operated under the Canadian Human Rights Act. Then in '83, we were given a mandate to look at specific federal activities under the Federal Privacy Act. Then later in 2000, our mandate was expanded over the commercial sector through passage of PIPEDA, Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. All that is a long way of saying we are a arm's length body. We take complaints. That's our raison d'etre. That's why we were set up. But we are separate from the government. We report directly to Parliament. So what you're going to hear this afternoon from me anyway is I'm just going to try to sum up 30 years of work that the office has done around the importance of encryption and try to crystallize it. And I'm going to try to do that in about 5 minutes. So we'll see if this works. So I really have three main points to make because Chris and Brenda have really done a brilliant job of setting up the general landscape and talking about rights. So my first point, and these are all elementary, and I'm going to guess everyone on the call already knows many of them. The first point is that strong encryptions in the hands of the public does more good every day around the world than any sort of inverse situation, by which I mean weakening encryption while perhaps allowing for more effective law enforcement does a potentially huge harm to the public good of privacy protection that encryption allows. That's my first point. Second point is that any governmental effort to try to dismantle that situation, because publicly available strong encryption has been around for about 3 going on 4 decades now, would run into huge logistical problems, huge legal roadblocks, huge civil society pushback, and still, at the end of all of that, probably wouldn't be terribly practical. That's my second point. And the third point that I was going to make is that this is very often, and Brenda alluded to it, Chris did too, in the going dark discussion, encryption is framed as a problem for the rule of law. I think there's something fundamentally miscast about this argument. This is not really a technical point, but I don't think it's splitting hairs either. I think that this is more a discussion about the reach of law. And I think we, as policy people and as interested advocates and as technologists, need to take apart some of the rhetoric here. Okay, so I'm going to go into a little more detail on those 3 points. But again, I'm going to try to do it very quickly. This idea of privacy as a public good and encryption being the grounds for that. Here I'm just drawing on some of the audits that our office has done, some of the data breach investigations that we have done, some of the individual complaint investigations that we have done, where use of encryption by organizations would have made a massive difference in the harm that inevitably came when data was lost. So I'm sort of cherry picking here, but from that one example alone, I think, and so here we're just talking specifically about device encryption. Strong device encryption, which of course, you know, the U.S. authorities have gone all the way to the Supreme Court to fight Apple's use of strong encryption. The strong device encryption, when you're talking about data breaches and accidental data loss or accidental or unauthorized access, can make a world of difference between the number of people who are harmed and affected versus a relatively benign incident. And this problem is magnified as the storage capacity of the devices that get lost grows and grows and grows. We all know this, you know, you can fit the records of millions of individuals on a single thumb drive, and thumb drives go missing in organizations, be they governmental or commercial, all the time. This is a real problem when encryption isn't used. So strong encryption in the hands of commercial entities applied rigorously is incredibly important, and weakening it is not a great idea. Second thing, and I won't dwell on this for very long, is this point about encryption now, device encryption, end-to-end encryption, public key encryption. These are technologies, again, that have been widely dispersed in open source available formats for years. And so there is a real question about logistically, legally, and pragmatically, governments can forbid, ban, or weaken their use. And it's interesting to me that looking around the world, and there's been some good studies about this, governments have tried a sort of mixed bag of legislative proposals. They have tried to set limits on cryptographic system keys. They have tried registration requirements. They have tried export approval regimes. No one has really found a way, no country in the world has found a way of truly hobbling cryptographic implementation because there literally is a mathematical and physics problem around a government trying to do that. That's my second point. Last point, and it'll very quickly, is this idea that encryption has created a rule of law problem. So we hear this a fair bit, specifically from law enforcement. Any objective definition of what the rule of law is comes down to private citizens not having their property at the disposal of the government. I'm quoting Hayek there. So that's one definition of what the rule of law is. Another definition of the rule of law, this one's taken from international human rights law, is that any police powers have to comport with fundamental political rights. And those things are like privacy of communications, the exercise of free speech, freedom of assembly. Another cornerstone of the rule of law is that the same rule applies to everyone, whether they're in the government or a private citizen. Now, by any of those definitions of the rule of law, encryption actually protects the rule of law. It doesn't erode it. So again, this is maybe me splitting hairs. Maybe I should, not be quite so hung up on the wording. But I really think that very often what is framed as a rule of law problem is more about the reach of the law. And that's a whole different valid discussion to have, but I think you have to have it under different terms when it is appropriate, and it becomes more of a warranting question. What authorization needs to be used? Which sort of levels of approval have to take place before an investigative method gets used? Those sorts of questions. So those are my 3 points. Thank you. Tried to breeze through them. The same back to you.
Thank you, Chris Prince, and really appreciate the try to be concise and to the point. I realize that we started a few minutes late. That's why we're giving this kind of leeway to go over for a few minutes. Really appreciate the putting the framing of the rule of law on the extent can be applied in the right setting to preserve privacy rights and other human rights concepts. Given the time where we are, perhaps I just want to raise one question. We have several questions coming from the audience, but perhaps I can raise one of them, and that can be coupled with final 1 minute intervention from each of you. There is, what can we do next, particularly in terms of awareness, raising the awareness of policymakers, raising the awareness of the public, where we can, as a coalition, for example, intervene and have a positive impact on the debate and the policy discussions moving forward. Chris Parsons, please begin. 1 minute, please. You're muted, Chris, you're muted.
I think that one of the things that Citizen Lab brings to this sort of discussion is we engage in technical assessments as to how things actually work, and then we combine them with legal and policy analyses. So I think that one of the areas that we've seen is the Zoom report that the lab came out with really excited a conversation about what is the contours of encryption. And one of the things that comes across is the actual way that the policy for Zoom was framed was inaccurate and incorrect. So one of the ways of moving it ahead is actually trying to see what's going on, lifting the lid of the internet, which is one of our motifs. So bringing more data to the table, I think, is important. And then combined with that, making clear why that data matters. We're all using Zoom, which is why it's so important. If we'd released the same report in December, I think it would have been important, but it wouldn't have had the same impact just because it wasn't used by everyone and their dog and their grand dog. So I think that that's one of the ways of moving policy forward is civil society, experts, we know what the arguments are. That's pretty well hashed out. We know what the policy positions are, we know what the risks are. And like what Brenda said, when windows show up, really explaining, using this opportunity to explain to people, and this is why this stuff matters. They're not going to stick with us all for months and months, but we can communicate to them now, and that'll over time build awareness.
Thank you very much, Chris. Brenda, please. Final thoughts.
I think that we need to be as a community and as a coalition both strong in supporting what we know to be true about the real benefits of encryption, and we've all been talking about them. I talked far too much, and I'm sorry. But we also need to be cognizant about the claims that we make in that the best encryption in the world isn't going to protect individuals from the sort of knock-on effects of social sorting and mass surveillance. And so we need to find that sweet spot in terms of making legitimate claims about the technology and also opening up recognition that while it's one step in a rights protective technological framework, it can't be the only step that we need.
Thank you, absolutely. Chris Prince, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've nicely framed the stakes. I mean, the stakes are really quite high. They are not just the protection of rights. They're not just the protection of people's comfort level with the new communication tools, or working from home, or e-commerce, all of which have become really, really important in the last 2 or 3 months. The stakes, I mean, really couldn't be higher. I think the trick with getting this on people's radar publicly, and I include our elected officials in this, and just as much as the public, is they have to become sensitized or aware of just how much encryption they're already relying upon. And you know, Chris Parsons and the CCLA have done great sort of plain language, real world examples of building that out. But I can't understate how crucial it is for us as a society to, like, you know, keep in mind that many of the electronic systems that we are now wholly reliant upon, down to, you know, supply chains and all of those stuff, those don't work super well without strong encryption. So, you know, like that trust in those processes is based on those things, and to break those things now will put a lot of people in harm's way. So I would end on that.
Thank you much, Chris. Really agree. Thank you for stressing these points, which sum up that the encryption discussion, the encryption intervention is really here to stay, and will maybe under the umbrella of this coalition, collaborating with entities like Citizens Lab, like CCLA, and Open Media was hopefully part of the attendance. With the oversight of entities, independent entities like the OPC, we can really direct the policy discussion in the right direction to preserve the trustworthy communication, at the same time the trust of the user community and government and law enforcement. Thank you very much for this discussion. I will share the final slide for to thank you as speakers, thank you as attendees for your diligence and staying with us, for your interest in this discussion. I invite you to join the Global Encryption Coalition and to see potentially quite some collaboration and output from the coalition in the days to come. Thank you very much for being with us. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Thank you.